everyone. I need my paper in front of me because these are not my words that you need to hear today, they're God's, and I don't want to mess it up. Now I know what Garrett was getting all choked up about. It's going to take me just a second. This is... Okay. A lot of people have asked me why I'm speaking out at these events. I'm not making money off of it. I mean, people have offered to pay me as an attorney to work in their favor in a case and to fight a ticket or a citation, but I told them at this point I've got to fight something bigger. And that's because I'm here in events like this today, because I will not stand by and watch our governor, our attorney general, local prosecutors, and law enforcement. I won't stand by and watch them continually break the law. I am not advocating for civil disobedience. That's kind of like a popular term, especially among the Tea Party members. But civil disobedience is where you think the law is one that should not be enforced. I'm advocating for civil obedience because the law is very clear. None of the governor's executive orders have any legal authority after April 30th. I advocate for Michigan residents all across our state to exercise their rights, all of their rights, to open their businesses, to go in public without a mask if they choose, to participate in social functions without a social distancing requirement, like birthday parties, funerals, events like this, AA meetings. I'm also advocating for people to have discussions, respectful, educational discussions with their local law enforcement, prosecuting attorneys, and local government officials, to encourage them to follow the law as written, allowing people to exercise all of their constitutional and statutory rights without interference. All of the governor's executive orders from 2020-4 all the way through, last I saw was 2020-97, are based upon her emergency powers. However, the state of emergency and state of disaster ended as a matter of law on April 30th. While there are other legal provisions involved, and many of you have seen the briefs and things I've posted online that discuss those provisions, the main point is that both the 1945 Emergency Powers of Governor Act and the 1976 Emergency Management Act must be read together as required by the statutes themselves, as well as numerous provisions that have come down from the Michigan and United States Supreme Courts. So as required by MCL 30.403, one of the Emergency Management Act provisions, legislative approval is needed in order to extend the governor's emergency powers. And we all know that they did not extend those emergency powers beyond April 30th. Therefore, all of her emergency power executive orders lost their legal authority on that day. Right. By attempting to continue exercising these emergency powers after April 30th, Governor Whitmer is breaking that very law, MCL 30.403, and violating numerous constitutional provisions restraining her exercise of authority. Specifically, we can look at Article 3, Section 2 of the Michigan Constitution, which prohibits the governor from exercising authority properly belonging to the legislature, which is what she is trying to do by issuing all of these executive orders and telling law enforcement to go out and enforce them. The governor and Attorney General Nessel have told us that the governor is allowed to just terminate one state of emergency or state of disaster and keep reissuing them like they're just terms of art, like it's just sheets of paper. But that is not what either the 1945 or the 1976 statutes allow. And as we all know, the governor, or any government official, cannot act without the legal authority to do so. Also, many of the provisions in those executive orders clearly violate rights that are guaranteed to us in both the US and Michigan constitutions. MCL 30.421, the Emergency Management Act statute, requires executive orders and other emergency actions by the government to be done, quote, consistent with the provisions of the state constitution of 1963 and the federal constitution. Additionally, MCL 30.421 prohibits prosecutors from even prosecuting any violations of these executive orders in any, quote, manner that violates any constitutional provision. Prosecutors are further prohibited in the prosecution of these executive order violations from prosecuting, quote, conduct presumptively protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. These are not carve-outs for certain individual behaviors. No. This is a stern reminder to the prosecutors of the restraints placed upon the government in trying to regulate us, the people, even in states of emergency. The Attorney General blames legislator commentary for, quote, creating confusion among law enforcement officials tasked with enforcing these orders. Those are her very words. She claims the orders' legality is based on their reasonableness. Well, it's not reasonable to issue executive orders like they're going out of style. Like I said, there's at least 97 of them. And that's just, over 2 months' time. It's not reasonable to treat statutory emergencies like a term of art, like a light switch that you can turn on and off, instead of the actual urgent situations these emergency powers are meant to address. It's not reasonable for the governor to exercise powers properly belonging to the legislature, especially after the statute specifically prohibits her from doing so. And on that point, as a side note, I went and looked at every single executive order that the governor has issued since she's been in office, and every single one in 2019, every state of emergency, every state of disaster, she actually specifically references both of the statutes and says that those emergencies cannot last past that 28th day without legislative approval. Go figure, she knew it then, but she doesn't know it now. It's also not reasonable to interpret the statutes to allow the governor to circumvent that 28-day time frame simply by just issuing new orders that address the same emergency conditions. It's common sense, people. We as attorneys or legislators or judges are not allowed to make things overly complicated. A lot of people have been worried that they just have to take the governor's word for it because they think, well, I don't have a law degree. I can't read the law. I can't read those constitutional provisions and understand what that means to me. Yes, you can. Please read the law yourself. Please read the Constitution yourself. I believe that you are smart enough to read that. I believe my 4 children are smart enough to understand the rights that they are guaranteed in the Constitution. We must also note that it's not reasonable for this governor to think that she can unilaterally extend these states of emergency or disaster when no other governor before her ever did so on their own without the legislature. It's also not reasonable to assume that the legislature enacted the whole Emergency Management Act for the sole purpose of deferring to this old 1945 Act they keep talking about. Why would they waste the time enacting that law if we already had one on the books that said everything they wanted it to say? It's also not reasonable to issue or enforce executive orders that infringe upon any constitutional rights, especially when those rights are explicitly preserved in the language of the Emergency Management Act itself. But let us also remember that it doesn't matter if a constitutional provision specifically calls for violating constitutional rights, because the Constitution is the law of the land. No government action, no state of emergency or state of disaster, no pandemic, no virus can ever take those constitutional freedoms away from us, nor can it take away or diminish the constitutional restrictions placed upon the government officials. It's also not reasonable to enforce the executive orders explicitly focused on, quote, keeping people away from each other. end quote. That's what they say. That's what our government officials have said the whole purpose of these is. See, those, when you try to keep people away from each other, those are the same people that are guaranteed the right to assemble, to collectively worship, to express their speech, and to petition the government, and they're not meant to do that in solitude in their own homes. Like I said, all the executive orders that she's been issuing are based upon the governor's emergency powers. So, with the state of emergency lawfully ending on April 30th, all of those emergency powers came to an immediate end. So without those powers, literally all of those executive orders became unenforceable. I can't tell you, I mean, I take that for granted. I knew as soon as I went to bed, and it was slightly after midnight, April 30th, I knew what that meant, and I put a little 2-sentence post on my Facebook page. But so many, hundreds, if not thousands of people are reaching out to me saying, well, but what about having to wear masks in public? What about, if I open my restaurant, I know I have to keep, people 6 feet apart. Well, I know that this executive order says that, or this executive order says this. Every single one of those emergency power executive orders is null and void. In other words, we as individuals, all of us, are lawfully allowed to travel, assemble, worship, conduct business, go to places of public accommodation, and exercise every single one of our rights without any attempt by law enforcement, prosecuting attorneys, or local government officials to infringe upon those rights. What's important to note, though, is that all attorneys, law enforcement officers, and public officials took an oath to uphold the U.S. and Michigan constitutions. And if you actually look it up, it's in our Constitution, Article 11, Section 1. It doesn't say that they even have to uphold and support the laws of the state of Michigan, because they knew. Sometimes we do have laws on the books that cannot be enforced because they violate the Constitution. So the oath by judges, by school board members, by governors, attorney general, just any old attorney practicing law in the state of Michigan says that they will uphold the U.S. and Michigan constitutions, period. Therefore, if any of those people attempt to enforce any of these executive orders at all, they're violating their oath of office. They're acting outside of their scope of governmental authority. They are engaging in malicious prosecution and abuse of process. Shoot, they're even violating 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 and 18 U.S.C. Section 241. That's right. It's funny because I shared this very information. I literally spent hours, days, weeks with my friend Ashley that's over there somewhere, right in front of me, with my husband, with several people who are in this freedom fight, collecting all of the email addresses for prosecuting attorneys, city attorneys, police departments, and sheriff's departments all over the state of Michigan. There's hundreds, maybe thousands. What we did is we got those email addresses so we could send this information that I compiled for them, to urge them to uphold their oath of office. And I have gotten several responses where they clearly say to me, you know what, we are not going to enforce these unconstitutional orders, but thank you for writing this. But there are some I've received that don't say such nice things. Funny thing is, they can't actually point out which legal provision I'm saying is wrong. But what they do say is that, quote, this is only an opinion, or these statements are threats against us as prosecutors and police, or only a judge's opinion is what matters in times like these. To that I say to you, the very words of our U.S. and Michigan constitutions are not opinions. And this is only a threat to those who are attempting to violate the U.S. and Michigan constitutions. So if you plan to do that to us, please do take this as a threat. But this is not a physical threat. This is not what Gretchen Whitmer and Hillary Clinton and the media have turned us into. We are not advocating violence. We are asking prosecuting attorneys, law enforcement, and government officials who break the law and violate the Constitution by enforcing these defunct executive orders to feel threatened by losing their job, receiving disciplinary action, being removed from public office, being personally sued for acting outside of the scope of their governmental authority, and finally being criminally prosecuted for their actions. But they should not be physically threatened. They should not have their homes threatened, and they should not have their families threatened. After all, we have the law on our side, and we don't need to resort to illegal or threatening tactics to win this fight. So I know there's still some of you out there that know this is wrong, but you are feeling that biblical edicts require you to comply with her executive orders anyway. To anyone who is seriously thinking that is the case, I ask you to consider this. Romans 13 requires you to submit yourself, quote, to the governing authorities. So what is this governing authority? Governing authorities look different in countries all across the globe. But here, our government derives its power from the consent of the governed, as emphasized in our very Declaration of Independence. And here, authority is the right to act legally on another's behalf. Governments have authority for conduct that is authorized by the Constitution or by a statute. Our governor derives her authority from enumerated, meaning limited, powers in Article 5 of our state constitution. Our Constitution expressly prohibits her from creating laws. That provision I said earlier, Article 3, Section 2, that's what the legislature's for. Let alone in executive orders that cover more than one subject. So she's breaking Article 4, Section 24. Or to modify parts of laws without including the entire text of the law as amended. She's violating Article 4, Section 25. Our state constitution requires the governor to wait 90 days before enforcing new laws unless 2/3 of the House and Senate have voted to give it immediate enforcement. So she's violating Article 4, Section 27. But let us not forget about Article 4, Section 39, of our state constitution, which requires all state and local governmental operations to continue in periods of emergency. Why is she forgetting about that part of our Constitution? In fact, her newest order today, 97, I believe it was, maybe it was 96, it's hard to keep track, specifically said governmental operations are to be canceled, but for a few limited exceptions. But, like I said earlier, Article 11, Section 1 of our state constitution also requires all public officials, like I mentioned, legislators, judges, law enforcement, school board members, the governor, etc., to support the U.S. and Michigan Constitution. And there is no provision for times of emergency. In fact, our Constitution was drafted in the midst of an emergency. So the governor, police officers, or anyone else trying to enforce these executive orders are in many ways acting outside of their governmental authority. And so that brings us back to Romans 13 and verse 7, which says, give everyone what you owe him. Well, we don't owe it to her to follow her instead of our Constitution or our laws. And since we, the people, established our state and federal constitutions, we owe it to each other to follow those very documents. But also remember Isaiah 1:17 that tells us to seek justice and rebuke the oppressor when dealing specifically with rebellious governments. And Ezekiel 11, verses 1 through 4, that tells us that when, quote, leaders of the people, end quote, are, quote, giving wicked advice to the people of their cities or areas that they govern, God calls us to speak out against them, to speak the right words at the right time and in the right way. So we all know that the governor has had several lawsuits already filed against her for these illegal executive orders. And you can wait for a court to sort it all out if you want to, but I won't. I did not get my rights from a court, from a governor, from an attorney general, or anyone. I got my rights from Almighty God. And our U.S. Constitution was written to, quote, secure those blessings in a capital B of liberty with a capital L, and that's said in our U.S. Constitution preamble. And here, quote, we, the people of the state of Michigan, grateful to Almighty God for the blessings of freedom and earnestly desiring to secure these blessings undiminished to ourselves and our posterity, end quote, established our state constitution of 1963. These liberties are to be exercised by all people, unabridged and undiminished by the very text of the constitutions themselves, during times of emergency or not. So I am going to follow the law, the Michigan Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and exercise my rights now without waiting for permission to do so. I urge you to do the same. And for those of you interested in trying to respectfully hold all of the law enforcement and prosecuting attorneys in your communities to their oath of office, I will post this speech and all the legal provisions on the website stopcovidchaos.com, as well as on my personal Facebook page, so please check it out. Thanks.